Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, at least for part of this episode, coming to you live from a hotel room in Germany. How are you, Mr. O'Toole?
It is great to be alive after a long flight to Frankfurt.
Tim is here, spry and sleep deprived, ready to give some hot takes on new developments that just came in over the weekend. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're doing this a little differently today, in part because of some big events that have just transpired in the last couple of days. So what we did was we actually recorded on Friday, May 6th, and we recorded a full episode, which was ready to go. And then, of course, on Sunday, May 8th, OFAC had decided out of the kindness of their heart to drop a couple of big new announcements and developments on us relating to Russia. So we're going to start with that. We're going to do a quick few takes on what happened over the weekend with respect to Russia and the new determinations that were announced on Sunday. And then we're just going to segue into all of the previously recorded content. So this is a little trick of editing genius from our friends Matt and Anthony, and we will go from there.
It's an emergency podcast.
This is a bit of an emergency supplement to our prior what we recorded previously. So without further delay, the normal caveats to start: we're not giving legal advice, we're not discussing confidential information. Anything you hear today is solely attributable to me and or Tim. Blame us if you disagree or dislike. You can find Embargoed anywhere you get your pod content. Please subscribe if you enjoy the pod. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating, and spread the word. So here is the roadmap for today. As I already said, the new lead topic is going to be the latest OFAC announcements on 1 day in advance of Victory Day in Russia on May 8th. Specifically the two new determinations that came out relating to the accounting, trust, corporate formation, and management consulting services sectors. Then we're going to go into some recent remarks by Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General, about the fact that sanctions are the new FCPA. Then we're going to look a little bit at China and Russia and how the interplay there and how the U.S. is responding to that. Then we're going to go to the new Russia-Ukraine or Ukraine-Russia related sanctions regulations, which were just released or re-released, amended and expanded. We'll talk about that briefly. And then the lightning round, we're going to probably wrap up for all time our discussion of Virgil Griffith's case by talking about the indictments announced against his two co-conspirators, and finally bring it home with a quick bit on Nicaragua and a tiny bit on Venezuela as well. So with that, let's jump right in. So the new topic number one, over the weekend, as I said, a day in advance of Victory Day in Russia, OFAC made a major announcement. So there was a long list of designations announced on Sunday, middle of the day Sunday. This is not when we're typically have our radar up looking for big new OFAC announcements, but be that as it may, this is the way it played out over the weekend. So big list of designations that were announced and two new determinations that were made. The first with respect to EO 14024, which now makes the again, the sectors that I mentioned earlier, the accounting, trust, and corporate formation services and management consulting sectors of the Russian Federation economy are now all identified pursuant to 14024. So any persons operating in those sectors or who have operated in those sectors are now fair game to be designated, and that is effective immediately. So that was number one. But point number two, the related point, which quite frankly is, I think, the bigger point for those of us here in the U.S., under Executive Order 14071, which we teased this when we discussed it the last time, that we were very eager to see what services were going to be targeted first by the U.S., and now we know. There is a determination that was issued under 14071, which now means that the following is prohibited: the exportation, re-exportation, sale or supply directly or indirectly from the U.S. or by United States person, wherever located, of accounting, trust and corporate formation, or management consulting services to any person located in the Russian Federation. There's a couple of carve-outs, including with respect to entities in Russia that are under control directly or indirectly by U.S. persons, and certain services related to wind down or divestiture activities. But that is pretty broad. And two notes on that. Number one, these prohibitions don't go into effect for 30 days. So it's June 6th, I believe, is the
I think it's
effective
the
date.
7th.
June
I think it's
7th.
the
I'm sorry,
7th.
June 7th. My math was off. June 7th, and then so June 7th, these go into effect, and then there's also a GL that's already been issued, which is going to provide a 30-day wind down period thereafter. So we're talking about July 7th, effectively, as the end date. It's sort of a 60-day window when all of this will take full force. Um, the other interesting thing is, and for those who are tracking this globally, this is somewhat similar to what the EU announced a few weeks back. It's a little different, but in the same vein as what the EU announced and has also been adopted, I know, in Switzerland. And so, but OFAC has given some guidance, hopefully, along with this in the form of some FAQs. And what is clear from the FAQs, if you look at the definition, and I'm not going to read this, but if you look at the definition of accounting services, trust and corporate formation services, management consulting services, these categories are pretty broad. They are quite broad, and they're also clear that the guidance is also clear that these apply to all U.S. persons. So it's not just persons who are sort of in those specific niche areas or defined areas, accountants or trust services companies or management consulting companies, what have you. Lawyers, for example, I'm certain are going to be impacted by this, and a number of other folks who are doing work relating to Russia in these areas. And obviously, the idea here, the theory behind this is that these services are essential to the so-called oligarchs and other sanctioned Russian parties, and Putin cronies and et cetera, of sort of hiding and growing their assets in plain sight with the help of U.S. persons. And so this is designed to cut that off, obviously. And so again, this is going to be a pretty big deal. And I think implementation and navigating this and how people sort of step away from all of this is going to be complicated in the next 60 days. So let me just pause there and let me throw it over to you, Mr. O'Toole. What are your having, not even 48 hours to think about this, being having the benefit of being delirious after an overnight flight, perhaps that has rattled around some strands of genius in your brain. What are your new thoughts on this today?
Well, first, these thoughts are given in the spirit of NATO cooperation, since I am in a fellow NATO country overseas, and that is, one of the themes of the entire new Russian harmful foreign activities program is that everything is coordinated, and this was coordinated. I mean, as you pointed out, Brian, I mean, these are categories of services that the EU has already gone after. I guess my biggest, and I guess my second point is, we did not predict this. I think when we often do predict things before they happen. This one we did not predict at all. I think we took a stab at predicting which services would be first. These were not on our list. And so that's really my question, and I don't really have a real answer to it, is why these first? I assume that, and again, I don't have an answer, but I'm still going to give an opinion. I'm assuming that OFAC and or the State Department and or the allies had some information that there was kind of widespread activity going on in Russia with respect to these sorts of services being used to move around assets or being used to potentially hide assets, and that was the reason that it happened on a Sunday. Although I think your point is actually a very good one as well, that it was probably in advance of May 9th as well. But I think the fact that it happened on a Sunday, I mean, we don't often see OFAC programs or determinations come out on a Sunday with respect to this sort of thing, and so I'm assuming that there was some sort of emergency going on. that they felt there was an emergency with respect to these services and that they had to shut them down immediately. But having said that, if you have to shut them down immediately, then why do you give a 60-day period to essentially let them wind down? So that could be completely wrong, but if it is wrong, then I have no real answer to the question of why these first and why on a Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that sort of we say this a lot that there's sort of a marketing angle to the way these things get rolled out, right? You're kind of getting more bang for your buck if you announce something on an anniversary or whatever the case may be. And so I do think this is all calibrated or was kind of it was there was I think the designation package was ready to go because it was sort of military focused and targeted to May 9th. And then this is I think a convenient add-on, which quite frankly hasn't, at least in the broader press, hasn't seemed to get a ton of attention yet. I mean, I know in the trade nerd community, this is stirring up a lot of discussion, but certainly in the broader press, I don't think this was sort of the final bit of the press release was talking about this, sweeping new action. But I think, it's probably not abundantly clear to people what this might mean in practice. So over the course of the next 60 days, we will see. I agree that I think it became, in the way that we have seen more activity out of what you're going to talk about this in a moment with the sanctions of the new FCPA with the klepto capture task force and the repo task force and some of these other efforts around the globe to hunt and seize ill-gotten gains or at least alleged ill-gotten gains of these various sanctioned parties that are affiliated with the Russian Federation or the Russian government. This is sort of a piece with that, I think. And so it does, in some ways, it does make sense that this is maybe the natural extension, and perhaps we should have known better since our friends in Europe had taken this step initially, that maybe the U.S. would take this step as well. Although I think it's just more well known and well understood that these are perhaps services that are more heavily relied upon by Russian nationals and by these types of again, so-called oligarchs in certain European countries. That's not to say that it doesn't happen here, but that's why we had our money on the energy sector, or sort of more broadly speaking, I guess, the financial services sector, as opposed to sort of this, which is somewhat a subset of the financial services sector, I guess you could argue, but it's not exactly. So in all events, I think it's an interesting sort of first salvo with the services prohibitions under 14071. And yeah, this will be interesting because I mean this is fairly unprecedented in terms of the type of sanction that is about to go into effect here, and the type of prohibitions that are now going to apply to U.S. persons and are going to apply. They have not yet. What I read there was, from the FAQ, they of course promise that there's going to be regs that will follow. We'll see how long it takes them to do that. That often takes a while. They did say that for purposes of the determination under 14071, OFAC anticipates publishing regulations defining the term Russian person to mean an individual who's a citizen or national of the Russian Federation or an entity organized under the laws of the Russian Federation. So if that is the case, again, that's quite broad, and that takes into account Russian persons who are not going to be actually in Russia. So that is, as a compliance matter, and as that's gonna be challenging, I think, to sort of navigate.
Yeah, I mean that's in line with the reporting that this was targeted at the oligarchs, and so the fact that that person in the Russian Federation is going to include persons who are not actually in the Russian Federation is not surprising from that. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on here, though, because on the one hand, the new sanctions on export, or the export sanctions or export controls, whatever you want to call them. They really do go much more broadly than hiding assets, right? I mean, they take out accounting, management, consulting services, and trust services from the entire. They take them off the board. So all sorts of legitimate services as well are taken off the board. If OFAC wanted to target, use of those services to hide assets, they could have easily done that. I mean, they could have made it, a limited prohibition that was targeting evasion, and they didn't do that. And so the big four accountants, everybody from the West is going to have to get out of Russia. But then it gets even worse, and I think that's what, and worse or more strict, depends on your perspective. But um, the 14024 sanction then makes it impossible for Russian professionals to carry out these services as well within Russia without risking some sort of U.S. sanction. Now, how serious that sort of sanction is for professionals acting within Russia, when there's also a law that would make it criminal for them to withhold their services on the basis of sanctions, is a different question. But basically, what these sanctions have tried to do is shut down that entire sector of professional services in Russia, and certainly force anybody with a U.S. nexus to get out of Russia. And even within Russia, you've still got some U.S. sanctions risk if you continue to provide those services. It's really a huge kind of attack on those services, both inside and outside of Russia. And I'm just wondering why that is. We've never seen it, at least I don't remember it in any other program.
One sort of maybe final interesting point that you just came to mind as you were talking about 14024 and the new determination there. We've talked before about the idea that what it means to be part of the sector, a certain sector of a certain country's economy with respect to Russia or Belarus or some of these other countries that have now been targeted in this way, and whether or not you could actually be physically outside of the country and still be part of the sector of that economy, right? And so
Right.
it'll be interesting to see. And again, this would not really align with the general approach on secondary sanctions, which again we're going to talk about later when we talk about the new Ukraine-Russia sanctions regulations and what that means for COTSA 228. But in theory, if there was somebody sitting in Europe who was providing these services to a bunch of clients in Russia, would that person be susceptible to being designated under the new 14024 determination? I would think possibly yes, right? I mean, if they're seen as part of that sector of the Russian economy, even if they are physically outside of. So we don't usually think about it as physically elsewhere. It's usually confined to persons in the country. But if there were actors that are outside that are sort of still actively supporting those sectors, and that came to OFAC's attention, I would think they will reserve the right to say, yeah, that's fair game, and we could designate that person on that basis.
Oh, completely. If the EU or any of the NATO countries decide really not to enforce their own sanctions on this issue, I think the U.S. would reserve the right to do it. But I think that it's more targeted at countries like China,
right.
Other countries, to essentially say, and don't come in and try and fill this void because you'll be operating in the Russian management services sector or management consulting sector, and we'll designate you for that.
Right. Yeah, agreed. Okay, so this is a fascinating one and potentially a big deal. And obviously there's 60 days for this to sort of take effect and for the GL to expire. And so, we'll I'm sure come back to this in the future, but we did want to start here because, this is a pretty significant new development. And so with that, I will throw it to myself to talk about the new topic number 2. So for those who haven't seen this, this made a little bit of news, made a little bit of a splash. About a week ago, the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, was in New York for a day's worth of appearances and speeches, and she gave some remarks at a New York City Bar Association event, white collar event, and she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, in talking about some of the department's enforcement priorities. Actually, I have the quote here that was I think this is reported in the Wall Street Journal. She said to the room full of white collar enforcement lawyers, she was sort of prefacing or leading into the fact that national security related considerations are playing more of a part than ever, perhaps, in the department's white collar enforcement priorities. And she said, one way to think about this is as sanctions being the new FCPA. We've sort of paraphrased or reworked that as sanctions are the new FCPA, which we like. And so there was a lot of press coverage around this, and I'm going to throw this open to Tim in a moment. But I will say, so again, hats off to Lisa Monaco for sort of putting this out there and being the senior most DOJ or government official to kind of make this connection. This has certainly been a tagline or a pitch line or kind of a summation, I think, of the trend for quite some time. I've certainly uttered this. I'm certainly not going to take credit for this. I've heard others utter this over the last several years. I think it sort of neatly sums up the way things, we have recognized and live every day, day in, day out, year in, year out, the way things have been kind of trending. But I think it is notable, obviously, for the second most senior official at the Justice Department to make this explicit analogy or connection, and to really put a marker down that this is perhaps a new era or an inflection point for sanctions and export controls and national security focused enforcement in the U.S. Obviously, this builds upon some things that we've talked about previously. Some of the remarks that were made both by Lisa Monaco and her number two, John Carlin, last year, sort of putting this out there and sort of setting the stage for this. I think now, obviously, it makes some sense that she is perhaps doubling down on this position or this view, given everything that's going on with Russia and Ukraine, the klepto capture task force, the repo task force, all of the efforts that the department is throwing behind trying to vigorously enforce U.S. sanctions laws and related, money laundering laws and other laws that are out there to try to thwart, the sanctioned Russian and other parties out there who are trying to evade sanctions. So anyway, I will pause there. I'll throw it to you. What do you make of this? Is this a big deal? Is it not a big deal? Is it just kind of sort of a convenient time to sort of shine a light on something that's really been going on in large part for quite a while? Or what do you make of all this, Mr. O'Toole?
So, Mr. Fleming, I think that you're exactly right that the stage has been set for this for at least the last few months, probably the last year, where DOJ and the criminal side have been talking about a national security focus. Lots of news events push that. But at the end of the day, I think this is getting back to our constant theme for the last 6 months or so. All roads lead to Moscow. I mean, even as she announced this, what I was struck by was that she pivoted almost immediately to, and you better comply with the Russian sanctions. It's really important, and it's going to be a really big enforcement priority for us. And I think we're already starting to see some of that. I mean, in my view, one of the things that we've seen that has been relatively unprecedented is the way that the Commerce Department has aggressively enforced some of the export controls laws with respect to to airplanes in particular, but just generally, I'm seeing just such a heightened enforcement climate in Russia. It's a little bit similar to what we were seeing in China during the Trump administration, but I think like China on steroids would be a way to look at it. And so I think at the end of the day, it's an important announcement, not surprising in and of itself, but I think it has a lot to do with Russia.
Yeah, I agree with that. So two follow-on points. Number one, if loyal listeners of Embargoed will know that, despite the level of activity that we saw out of the Trump administration era, OFAC and BIS in particular, which is lots of additions to the entity list, lots of additions to the SDN list, touting the fact that there are more entities that have been added than ever before. We didn't actually see, to my mind, and I don't have the hard data in front of me, but I don't believe there was really a discernible difference in terms of the back end enforcement there, right? How many more settlements or how many more enforcement penalties were we really seeing during that era relating to conduct with those countries or those entities? I don't know that we were necessarily. We were seeing a lot of people thrown on lists, which, that is obviously a powerful tool and something that U.S. enforcers and regulators want to deploy kind of to, strategically into as, maximum effect at any given time. But we didn't necessarily see the back end piece of that. I think we are seeing both right now. And I think that is to Tim's point, the sort of klepto capture task force and the worldwide effort to try to seize assets that are, that are being alleged to be the proceeds of money laundering activities or are benefiting from sanctions evasion and et cetera. I do think we are seeing a little bit of a squeeze now from from multiple directions in a way that we haven't before. So I do think that that's one notable thing. The other thing that I would say is um, if you look at the DOJ summary of Lisa Monaco's remarks, which is the readout of Dag Monaco's trip to New York, they make special care to summarize her remarks and then say she stressed that it's critically important for financial institutions and international corporations alike to pay close attention to the Russia sanctions. To build on what Tim said, that doesn't get into the readout unless that is a critically important sort of talking point and enforcement priority for for the DOJ writ large, for the criminal division, for national security division. So I do think, and I mean, to people who follow this all the time, that's kind of a painfully obvious thing that we would hope not too many people out there who are in financial institutions or multinational corporations are going to be all that surprised by. But it is notable that those segments in particular, those audiences are being called out specifically in connection with this announcement. So I do think that means something.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say, both of us work with a lot of financial institutions and multinational corporations. And I can say very explicitly and emphatically that it is certainly on the radar screens of the clients that we've talked to, including many clients for whom it may not have been on the radar screen prior to this round or to the February 2022 Russian sanctions. So it's a big deal. It's getting a lot of attention. I think that Lisa Monaco's statements will cause it to get even more attention. You're right. It was highlighted by DOJ in the readout. And so, we will continue to see and hear more about the Russian sanctions issues. But to your point about the Trump administration and about the level of enforcement there, I think that both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, Biden with Russia, Trump with China, have done a good job of announcing and getting the word out about their sanctions. But I certainly feel like I'm seeing a lot more enforcement activity already on the Russia side than we ever really did on the China side. And setting aside some of the crazy enforcement actions that got overturned in court at the end of the Trump administration, there was a lot of enforcement type activity where, the Trump administration was trying to essentially force a sale of TikTok and pocket some of the proceeds. But apart from that, you didn't see a lot of kind of traditional enforcement activity where you've got agents out on the ground trying to enforce these laws. And here we're already seeing quite a bit of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a little bit more of a put your money where your mouth is. It's not just, lists and names and words. It's let's get law enforcement out there actually trying to, follow up on this and exact some pain on the targets of these things. So agree with all that. So let's leave that behind for the moment. Let's pivot over to China and to talk a little bit more about China and Russia and sort of an interesting little article that just came out a couple days ago that sort of perhaps shed some light on the current U.S. views on what China is or is not doing vis-a-vis Russia.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the conflict and when the NATO countries and NATO allies imposed what were pretty unprecedented sanctions and targeted the Russian financial industry in a way that we've never really seen before. One of the fears that was expressed, or one of the concerns that was expressed by some of the U.S. policymakers over in Europe, was that the Russians would be able to circumvent these sanctions by essentially locking on to the Chinese financial system, and the Chinese would allow their financial system to be used in ways that would dilute the effect of the sanctions, if not kind of blunt them altogether. And at the beginning of the conflict, we started to see some signs of this, but more recently, they really haven't been apparent. China's support for the war seems to have diminished, at least from outsiders. And then on May 3rd, Reuters did an article quoting members of the U.S. government, anonymously mostly, but still talking about how those fears have not really come to pass. And in fact, China abstained from the UN resolutions condemning Russia. China does not appear to be engaging in at least systematic sanctions evasion activities, certainly allowing their financial system to be used to circumvent the sanctions on many of the larger Russian banks. And so what we're seeing now, and what the article seems to confirm, is that Russia is not kind of getting the out through China that they thought they did. The article goes on to talk about the fact that China is not supporting Russia militarily either, but I'm not sure that was ever really a realistic fear. I think the real fear was that China was going to help with sanctions evasion, because it's not, Russia would not be the first country where China has done that, at least reportedly. I mean, you've got a lot of reports that China has helped circumvent North Korea sanctions, that China has helped circumvent Iran sanctions. China expressly has talked about how it thinks the sanctions, even these sanctions, are illegal and does not believe they should be enforced. And so it wouldn't have been surprising if China had gone in the other direction, but it appears not to have, at least so far.
Right. So a couple of quick follow-on observations there. I think it's the abstaining from the UN vote was characterized in the article as a win, and I would say though that the article goes on to note, and anybody who's tracking this will know this, that the rhetoric coming out of China and China state-run media is still largely parroting what Moscow is saying about the war, and it's not exactly, um, there's not much divergence there. So I think the idea that there's still some alignment, if not as much, perhaps, um, explicit support is I think a fair characterization at this point. I also think that my takeaway from this, and that's not just from this article, but just from everything that we've been seeing the first couple of months of the conflict, is that you know China has been characterized by many observers as, look, they are kind of the ultimate opportunists, right? And so if they are seeing which way the wind is blowing with respect to Russia, which is that Russia has become more and more isolated as this has grown on, dragged on rather, and coming out as a vocal champion of Russia is not going to, in the big picture, be helpful for China. It's no surprise that they're not doing that at the moment. It's also perhaps no surprise that, at least at the moment, it doesn't seem that with some of the, as Tim said, the sort of the big, um, crushing sanctions that have been levied against uh, the Russian financial sector, that they haven't necessarily swooped in to kind of bail them out. Now, as we've talked about before, when Russia's about to start defaulting on its debt, and if and when we get to the point where the Russian energy sector is more critically impaired by the sanctions, Exhibit A, Europe about to impose, an embargo on Russian oil, which is something that is just about to. It looks like it's just about to finally come to be and come to pass. And so, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months from now, when Russia has all these reserves of oil and China is the perhaps only or the best or the most immediate sort of willing buyer of all of that, and who knows what the state of sanctions will be with respect to some of the biggest Russian, oil companies at that point. Let's see how well they are behaving with respect to, abiding by the Western sanctions on Russia. So I think it's an interesting snapshot right now. Is kind of my general takeaway. I don't think anybody should be fooled into thinking that we're, the U.S. or anybody else is out of the woods with respect to China, kind of putting their finger or their hand or their arm on the scale in, on the side of Russia here, and perhaps, making this a much more complex and messy situation somewhere down the road. But I think for the moment, that's, as we discussed, I think that's kind of where things stand, and where it goes from here, it's hard to say. But I think that that's at least a good snapshot for now.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing that the article really didn't talk about and that occurred to me as I was reading it is I wonder whether any of this has to do with what China's going through right now. I mean,
Right.
China has its own issues with COVID right now. It's about the worst that it's been since the beginning in Wuhan. And so, is China's reluctance based on, a fear of the threat of US retribution? Is it because the war isn't going well, or is it because China's kind of tied up dealing with its own COVID problems, but once it presumably overcomes that and moves beyond it, does it turn towards kind of helping out Russia evade sanctions, supporting the Russian military effort? Does it become more aggressive after it gets kind of out of the COVID fog
Well,
that a
in
lot of.
yeah, and in particular, I think that's a really good point. In particular, to the extent that evading sanctions will help sort of reinvigorate or jumpstart the Chinese economy, which is now, by all reports, kind of going into a lull as a result of all the COVID related shutdowns. I think we have to presume that they are going to act in whatever they believe is their economic self-interest. And if they think that that is the way out, then that's probably what they will do. And then we may be crosswise with China before too long if that is in fact the way things play out. But we will see. Again, I think this is an interesting snapshot for the moment. In no way, shape, or form should this be considered to be set in stone for the foreseeable future. Um, so let's move on now to actually our final topic of the main portion of the episode today. So we are flying by our standards, and this is and don't mistake that for the lightning round sound effect. This is in fact an all Russia topic, and so just last week, a new version of the what had previously been the Ukraine sanctions regulations, which were issued several years ago, were updated and expanded and rebranded as the Ukraine Russia related sanctions regulations. They just were published in the Federal Register earlier this week. We're recording this on Friday, May 6th. They just were published on, I believe it was Monday, and so by and the issuance of new regulations is not usually a terribly noteworthy thing because most of the time it just codifies what's in the existing executive orders. But this actually covers quite a bit of ground. I think the regulations are fairly expansive, especially compared to what was there previously, and kind of consolidates a lot of guidance and a lot of moving parts because obviously the Russia sanctions program is multifaceted and has been stood up via statutes and executive orders and all kinds of authorities over a number of years and for a number of different reasons. So it's a little messy, and now it's much of that's now been consolidated in the new regs. We want to talk about sort of two things in particular. One, which is a topic that I think over the years, Tim and I have spent a lot of time thinking and talking to folks about, and I think has presented itself recently in kind of an interesting way. We talked originally when the new wave of sanctions were being announced in late February, early March, about how it was notable to our mind that there was not really any talk about secondary sanctions, COTSA, or in particular COTSA Section 228, which is for anybody out there who is a tried and true trade nerd knows is kind of the broadest of the secondary sanctions provisions and applies to potentially sweep up any conduct by foreign persons that facilitates or relates to significant transactions on behalf of um, persons subject to sanctions imposed with respect to the Russian Federation. So that's a key term there, and a few other sort of elements to that as well. But that's kind of the significant transaction and the person subject to sanctions imposed with respect to the Russian Federation. That's kind of always been the linchpin of that, and the thing that non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. companies in particular, have lived in fear of since COTSA was enacted in 2017, and the guidance, the FAQ guidance relating to significant transactions came out a little while after that, and so many, as we can attest, and as anybody out there who's ever looked at this knows, many companies I think over the years have been deterred from entering into certain transactions or engaging in certain transactions with sanctioned parties in Russia for fear that they would run afoul of COTSA Section 228. So more recently, when the new wave of sanctions came out and was largely being issued under EO 14024, the question arose whether or not persons that are sanctioned under 14024 would be considered persons subject to sanctions imposed with respect to the Russian Federation and thereby implicate COTSA 228. Well, it appears we have our answer, and it appears that, as indicated in the regs themselves and the supporting FAQs, notably the updated FAQ 546, that it does not cover persons sanctioned under 14024. It appears that the definition of that term, persons subject to sanctions imposed by the U.S. with respect to the Russian Federation, is limited to persons that are subject to sanctions under the Crimea-related executive orders, 13660 and series that were issued later that year, um, and um, and also the executive order that touches on the cyber EO that was issued around that same time, and that's it. It does not. It appears to leave out purposefully 14024. So it seems, and we know, and I know that we have gotten a number of questions about this in the last couple months. And in fact, I know that this is an issue that has been raised to OFAC pretty recently. And until this guidance came out and the new regs came out, they had kind of demurred on confirming or denying whether or not COTSA Section 228 would in fact cover people that were in entities that were sanctioned under 14024. So now it appears that, again, not legal advice. If you actually need us to look at this, please call, please email. But at first blush, it appears that is carved out, that is outside the scope of what is under this. So let me throw it to you, Mr. O'Toole. Thoughts, comments, reactions to that?
Well, I mean, we expected this. I think we did talk about it on at least one of the podcasts, and it did seem very intentional that OFAC and that the president had not cited TCATSA as an authority for Executive Order 14024, or really any of the executive orders in the Russian harmful foreign activities
Yeah.
sanctions.
Yeah.
So we expected it. I still think there are some issues there. I mean, the statutory language is that these
It's
secondary
pretty
sanctions
straightforward.
should apply to any person, quote, subject to sanctions imposed by the United States with respect to the Russian Federation. It's really hard to argue, and at some point we may have to do it. So I'm not going to say it's impossible to argue, but it's an uphill battle to explain why it is that that persons that are subject to sanctions under these more recent executive orders that were directly targeting the Russian Federation are not subject to sanctions imposed by the United States with respect to the Russian Federation. But hey, if OFAC wants to take that position, it can take that position. And again, it was pretty clear to us beforehand that that's what they were trying to do, and now they've made it express that that is what those terms mean. And so what I think, when you step back from it, what appears to really be going on here is that the administration has done what I believe to be a historically good job of marshaling a coalition of diverse interests among the NATO countries to really impose some very effective sanctions in a very unilateral way. And I mean that by saying you've got a big group of countries, so it's multilateral in that sense, but they're speaking with one voice, and that's what's unprecedented about it. They really are moving forward in this way, and I suspect that at the beginning of the process, one of the things that the Allies expressed to the administration was their extreme distaste for secondary sanctions. Europe hates secondary sanctions, and understandably so. They are sanctions that are applied to situations where the U.S. admittedly has no jurisdiction. They're non-U.S. transactions, and European sanctions have traditionally been focused entirely on conduct over which Europe does have jurisdiction. And so essentially the stay in your lane policy was adopted at the beginning of this. that is very tricky given the language of CATSA that does say that the secondary sanctions apply in the circumstances that we both just read. But I think that was part of the bargain, and I think the administration is adhering to its bargain, and I think it's a good bargain. I think it's just difficult to reconcile with CATSA. I suspect that if they were ever asked, and given truth serum so that they had to explain it honestly and candidly, that their defense of this position would be that CATSA is an unconstitutional usurpation of executive power by Congress with respect to national security, and that Congress really can't tell them how to carry out foreign policy, and that this coalition is a good reason why, because the president needs some flexibility in order to impose these sanctions in a way that protects national security and protects and promotes foreign policy, and so that they claim that it is part of the president's Article 2 executive powers, and the Congress essentially try to usurp it in CATSA. That they're obviously not stating that out loud, although I believe that President Trump said something like that in his signing statement, so that's not a new theory. But I would guess that if they ever had to fight it out, that would be their theory. But I don't think they're trying to pick a fight with Congress over this.
Yeah, interestingly, the party that might be harmed by this arguably would be Congress, because it seems that it's kind of cutting them off at the knees by interpreting it this way. And so, even just thinking through who would it be that would ever challenge this more restrictive interpretation, which I think undeniably is beneficial to the sort of regulated world to have it kind of truncated or limited in this way. And I don't know, unless there was some shift in opinion over time, or a misunderstanding as to what this does cover, and they come after somebody for arguably running afoul of something that seems to be not contemplated by the regs and by the scope of this. So I don't know. It is also worth bearing in mind that, as we've said a few times before, COTSA Section 228 is supposedly imposes mandatory sanctions,
Right.
which have in fact never been imposed on anybody for this type of conduct. And so the idea of mandatory sanctions being limited in this way, when at the end of the day, the president and Treasury have a lot of discretion to who it is they identify to be targeted by those mandatory sanctions, is another sort of interesting academic exercise in its own right. But in any event, I think it's an interesting, and honestly, I don't know that I've seen much said or written about this yet. It's only been a few days, so I'm not sure if the world was kind of already on, held our view that it probably didn't extend to 142.4 based on the signaling, or if, as Tim has said, it's just not at the moment a very big practical problem, because the U.S. is clearly signaling, I think, that they're not looking to enforce or go after, in particular, companies who are headquartered in allied countries for this type of conduct, because they're trusting that allies are kind of taking care of their own houses, so to speak, with respect to this type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it seems unlikely that we'll ever get into this debate in court, because you're right, Brian. I don't see
Who's the party that brings that
who's going to
lawsuit?
ever
I
get
don't know.
harmed to bring the lawsuit,
Right.
because the only party that's really harmed is Congress in this sense. But even there, it's hard to argue that Congress is harmed, because
Right.
it seems to be a core executive branch power to execute the laws, to enforce the laws, and here the executive is determining how it is that they're going to enforce the laws, despite the statutory language that tells them what they have to do in the enforcement context. It's still the executive discretion is kind of rule. It appears to be winning out, and not surprised over that.
Right. Agree with that. So with that, there's really only one other thing I was going to flag, which is a very sort of narrow point that I'll just sort of throw out there. And I don't know that there's really that much to say about this, other than to say that for those in the energy industry, especially um, in the oil production industry, there was a shift in the definition of what a shale project is under the regs. And this is obviously something that has been dating back to when Directive 4 came out, a number of years ago. This was defined, and I believe it was the same. It was the same FAQ 418 that was used to clarify what the definition of a shale project was, and now it has been it has been tweaked a little bit, and now the new definition says that it's defined under the new regs to include um, projects that have the potential to produce oil from resources located in shale formations, which has always been the case, as well as projects that have the potential to produce oil from resources located in fine-grained sedimentary rock formations, including shale, limestone, dolomites, sandstone, and clay. So that is something that's a little different. I know from some of our friends who are very close to, clients and otherwise who are sort of very close to the more operational side of oil producing and companies that support oil production. This is a pretty big deal, and so we just sort of throw that out there and flag that change for anybody who might not have seen that. Any big
Yeah,
comments on that, Tim?
you
You
know,
good comment?
I really do. I don't. I mean, I think it was intended as an expansion, but
Right.
my my degree in oil engineering is relatively stale, and so my ability to comment on that is pretty
And,
limited. Other than to say that it's another expansion of the
yeah,
sanctions, and
and, and,
I can't
and
tell how broad it is going to
well, and
be.
quite
But
quite frankly, given what we know about the impact that the sanctions are having, kind of at a macro level, with respect to any U.S. Companies that are staying involved in Russian energy and oil projects, in particular those that might be subject to Directive 4, query what the actual impact is going to be here, because I suspect that there may be plenty of companies who could be impacted by this if they elected to stay, but perhaps have already decided they were not going to
right,
stay.
right. I mean,
So that's
I
hard to
guess the
know right now, but that I think is another practical thing I would just throw out there.
yeah, I guess the other impact, and I haven't looked closely enough to know how real this is that because Directive 4 now applies to projects outside of Russia, I suspect that could be the real impact is if there are projects outside of Russia that didn't meet the definition of shale before but do meet it now, those would be the ones that would be impacted, because I don't think, at least as of now, that Western companies are out of dealing with Russian energy companies. They're just not doing it in Russia because of all the restrictions in Russia. But that
That's a
this
good
could
point.
change that. That's
That,
the only
yep.
effect. Well, and that's that I'm relying for that on my earth sciences class that I took in college that was affectionately known as rocks for jocks. And so that's the extent of my understanding of the principles here.
Amazingly enough, the earth sciences class I took at a different undergrad university was, or college rather, sorry, was termed the same thing. So that was the level of my expertise as well.
Exactly.
Okay, with that, we will put that behind, and we will move now and pause for the lightning round sound effect. And I will turn it to Tim to talk about the two individuals who have been indicted as co-conspirators of Virgil Griffith, who we talked about in the last episode.
So I think this may be the end of the Virgil Griffith series that we've been running on the podcast for the last year or so. But as our listeners will remember, Virgil Griffith is the person that we have affectionately referred to as the crypto bro, who went to North Korea to put on a training about cryptocurrency. And I think on the last episode, we talked about some of the bad emails that showed up at the sentencing, in which he was sentenced within the guidelines, which was pretty unusual. I think he got 63 months. But the emails were kind of bad enough that you started to understand why he would get a sentence like that. Some of the other people who were both recipients and sending the emails, encouraging and helping him plan that trip to North Korea, were indicted, and their indictments were unsealed almost immediately after the sentencing. One was a Spanish citizen, the other one was a citizen of the UK. The At the time of the unsealing, DOJ did a press release that described what they believed to have been the conduct. It was really pretty much the same conduct we talked about in sentencing with Virgil Griffith. And it remains to be seen whether these individuals will actually be extradited and really prosecuted for these crimes. But I think that the message is very clear that that DOJ is taking this very seriously, and you know, my my guess is that if those individuals were to travel to certain countries and certainly to the United States, they actually could wind up back here in New York to face these charges.
Right. I mean, I think that the practical impact is that these people are never coming to the United States again, um, or because they will be arrested, and that may be, quite frankly, the only way that they would ever be arrested. Because, as a general matter, even for close U.S. allies like the UK, extraditing on a conspiracy to violate IEPA charge is is difficult, extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, because of course, under the principles of reciprocity that are central to extradition proceedings, most regard sanctions laws as being a matter of foreign policy and aren't going to recognize the U.S. foreign policy in criminalizing U.S. foreign policy, essentially, especially if it deviates at all from the home countries. So I think that the odds that anybody is ever getting extradited here from the UK or Spain are very, very low. To me, this feels like a cleanup measure where they wanted to just unseal these indictments and get a little additional exposure to the case that had just concluded against Mr. Griffith after he was sentenced. It is notable, though, I would say. So two things. Number one, this does also feel perhaps of a piece with where we started, which is sanctions of the new FCPA, and taking the opportunity to perhaps add on and get a little more visibility and a little more notoriety in these countries in particular, which I'm sure were reporting on this when it was announced, that, beware getting crosswise with U.S. sanctions here, and don't feel like you have impunity to plan a cryptocurrency and blockchain conference with a rogue embargoed nation like North Korea, which is exactly what these two gentlemen are accused of having done, and recruiting Mr. Griffith to speak at it. And so, to Tim's point, I think it alludes to some emails and other things that seem to be pretty brazen in the disregard for the notion that there was anything that they had to worry about in terms of U.S. sanctions, and in fact discuss the idea that they could obscure what they were doing to make sure that they avoided detection by U.S. authorities. So, put all that together, and it's probably pretty obvious why these indictments were unsealed at this point. But again, whether we ever hear anything about this down the road again, and to Tim's point, this is probably the final exclamation point on this chapter of embargoed's discussion of Mr. Griffith and his case and his co-conspirators. But we did want to sort of call attention to this because it was rather noteworthy that they did sort of DOJ did take this final step.
Yes, a sad day.
Sad day. So for these two gentlemen in particular. So
and for our listeners, because I know everyone loves hearing exactly.
Who are weeping over this because they say we want more North Korea sanctions enforcement. Exactly. On embargo. That is, I think, the number one email request that we get is more North Korea sanctions enforcement, just burning up our email and our Twitter accounts at all times.
It's trending. It's trending on Twitter right now.
Our interns have too many tweets to respond to, and our PR people too many tweets to respond to on more North Korea enforcement content. So now we're going to give them a break, which is, I'm sure they'll appreciate. So with that, let's pivot to the final topic of the day, which is Nicaragua, and an interesting article that just appeared in the New York Times this week regarding what are apparently have been recent overtures from the Ortega family reaching out to senior U.S. administration officials, inquiring as to whether there might be a deal to be struck to get some sanctions relief. Both, I think, probably, I don't want to get the order wrong. I think first for the family itself, which appears to be suffering under the sanctions, and second for the country of Nicaragua as a general matter. In light of the fact, it appears that one of the country's obviously primary backers, allies, benefactors has been Russia. And I think they are now at the point of perhaps writing off Russia as being able to be much help to them in the near term, given the state of Russia's withering economy and the increasing sanctions in the war. And so apparently, again, the favored son of the Nicaraguan president apparently reached out. There was supposed to be perhaps a meeting that was to take place, which doesn't appear to have happened. But in any event, it seems that many insiders and observers, including some who were still part of the inner circle in Nicaragua until very recently, said, yeah, have confirmed, yes, the family is really suffering under the U.S. sanctions. The country is really suffering under U.S. sanctions. There is growing unrest both within the government and in the country that might perhaps move the needle on the regime's willingness to deal with the U.S. Perhaps what has been reported is perhaps they would be willing to release political prisoners and to address some of the more egregious human rights abuses that they have engaged in, and that has been a centerpiece of the U.S. sanctions since they were imposed a couple of years ago. And so an interesting wrinkle, I think, along with the idea, this also mentioned in the article that, and this has been reported elsewhere, that the U.S. has been in discussions with Nicaragua, and in particular, perhaps with the Maduro inner circle, about a similar topic, about some perhaps entertaining sanctions relief, and not surprisingly, with the increased strains on the global oil supply, Venezuela would seem to be obviously perhaps an elegant solution to that, if there could be some common ground reached as to how that would be structured and what the relief would look like and what would be garnered in return for the U.S. on the U.S. side. So anyway, a topic we haven't touched on recently, and an interesting intersection of many of our favorite topics. So we wanted to close with that today. And so I throw it to you, Mr. O'Toole, for your thoughts.
Three quick, hopefully quick points. I mean, first is when my daughter was much younger, she was a very little kid, one of the things she used to say whenever she wasn't getting her way was that you're not honoring my priorities. And I just pictured Laureano Ortega kind of going to the U.S. government and essentially throwing that kind of fit in saying that, because I think that at least was the image that I was left with when I read that story. Because I think that the truth is that the sanctions are now hitting the Ortega family hard, so they actually care about them. Whatever happened to the economy in Nicaragua, I doubt was going to have much.
And their grip on power may be growing more tenuous as a result, which is why they want to do this. Yeah.
Right. They want us to honor their priorities. But second, I mean, this is another all roads lead to Moscow type story, because their biggest benefactor was Russia, and Russia is having a hard time paying its own bills right now, and it's certainly not looking to pay Nicaragua's bills, I suspect. And so Nicaragua needs to look elsewhere. One place that it would have looked, I think, previously and has looked in the past has been Venezuela, but Venezuela is having its own issues. But at the same time, Venezuela is in discussions, at least as I understand it, and I think we've talked about this before on the podcast. It's in discussions with the U.S., reportedly in discussions with the U.S., to lift the sanctions in exchange for some sort of deal with the Maduro government. It sounds like from the article that there may be a grand bargain that's being worked on, in part because Nicaragua can't turn to Venezuela. It might be, wrap itself into the Venezuela, whatever deal is going on there, to lift sanctions in exchange for some sort of better changed behavior. So those are the three thoughts that I had when I read that. We'll see if that pans out, but just the biggest thing that I've left with was kind of the...
Yeah, no, good points. And I think I will end on this, which is, interestingly, there was a picture in the article of young Mr. Ortega in China with a senior Chinese official not that long ago. And so obviously China, another sort of lurking benefactor for Nicaragua, and closer ties certainly are trying to be built there, I think, by the Nicaraguan government. Interestingly, that was in connection with Nicaragua's decision to not recognize the independence of Taiwan any longer, and to sort of kowtow to China's wishes there and curry favor in exchange for further support from China's government in Nicaragua. But it does not seem at the moment that is going to be enough to sort of salvage what seems to be a spiraling situation there economically and otherwise. And so agree that perhaps we will certainly be keeping an eye on this. And if there is some grand bargain to be struck, and if it wraps in Venezuela and Nicaragua together, that would truly be fascinating. Who knows if that is really achievable at the moment, but just again, all roads do lead back to Moscow in some ways these days. But I think we wanted to end on a slightly different note, because quite frankly, we spend too much time talking about Russia, and we would like to talk about just about anything else at this point. So
Well, we're talking about roads outside of Russia
true.
that
That's
lead
true.
back there.
That's true. And so with that, I think that's all we have for today. I think we are going to come in comfortably under the hour mark. So a successful episode from that standpoint. We will be back, I think, at the end of the month. So this will be up sometime next week, probably middle of the week, around May 10th, 11th. We will be back toward the end of the month, probably just before Memorial Day in the States here for another episode. And until we do, I hope everybody stays safe and stays sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody. Looking forward to seeing my friends in Germany next week, and probably when the pod comes out. So see you
Exactly. All right. Bye, everyone.
Then. Bye.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.